Okay, to show you some new features of the suggestion report which relate to acute toxicity calculations, I'm going to work through a small example in a guidance document. This is a European Chemicals Agency. I'm going to go to a particular page, which you see here is an example 11, and it's for calculating the acute toxicity, or I guess estimating the acute toxicity oral route for a mixture with 5 ingredients. You see them lined up here, and 3 of them have LD50, so they have lethal doses for oral route, but then ingredients 2 and 4 don't have any data, and we're going to consider them unknowns in terms of the acute toxicity estimate. When you have over 10% unknowns for a particular route, then you use an equation where you subtract those unknowns from 100%. So let's go and do that within the program. The other thing I want to mention is for each of these that they have knowns, 1, 3, and 5 ingredients, they have a particular category as well as a measurement. And so the enhancement to SDScribe is that we have added the ability to put these measurements in as well as the classifications. So let's show you that. The first thing I'm going to do is create the ingredients or components as new substance records. So this first one, let's call it ingredient 1, and here we have a classification of category 3, right? That's the first line. So open this up, oral category 3. And in addition, we have that measurement of LD50. So I'm going to go to the toxicological table tab on the substance, and I'm going to put in an LD50 of 125. So that is in this kind of new area here under oral, 125 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Let's say done, and then add our next ingredient. 2. This one is the unknown. Okay, so we don't have any data. We're not going to put in a hazard at all here, a hazard, acute toxicity hazard classification. So, but we are going to go back to those new fields under toxicological table, and we're going to check this box for unknown, because what that means is there's an unknown acute toxicity in the oral route of administration. So we'll say done, and then create ingredient 3. And here we do have a category, so hazards 1 tab, and we're going to put it in. It's an oral category 4. Okay, for ingredient 3, category 4. It's kind of confusing. And then we do have a 1500 milligram per kilogram. So let's go to the toxicology table, and up here we're going to put in 1500 milligrams per kilogram for the oral. Done. Let's add ingredient 4. And let's see, for that one we have again an unknown. Okay, so we're not going to put in a hazard. Instead, we're going to go to the toxicological table and again check unknown. So it's unknown for acute oral toxicity. Click done to close. And now we're going to add our last ingredient, which looks like our most toxic one, 5. And I say that because when we go to the hazards tab here, we're going to put in category 2, which is a more toxic oral category. They go in reverse order. And so now if we go to the toxicological table, because again they have a LD50 which is lower, much lower than the others, we'll put that in 10 milligrams per kilogram. Alright, so we've got our 5 ingredients entered. Let's go back to the browse list for safety data sheets, and we'll do a new safety data sheet. New blank one. And we'll call it ECHA product. Now let's go to the composition tab, and we're going to enter all 5 of those ingredients. And we'll put the first one first, and it's 4%. You see that on the available information row? So we'll put in 4%. And the second one, I'm just double clicking into the table here to create a new ingredient. ECHA ingredient 2. And that one is 92%. Okay, and then ECHA ingredient 3. That one is 3%. Okay, now ECHA ingredient 4. This is another, the unknown one, and it is 0.9%. Okay, and ECHA final one, ingredient 5. Oops. Typing too fast. ECHA ingredient 5. And this one is 0.2%. You notice that? I just want to say about that, because it's in category 2 of the oral, the 2% is okay, right? Because the threshold for relevant ingredients when you're doing these calculations is generally 1%. But when you're in oral category 1 or 2, which are the most toxic, you get a break and it goes down to 0.1 threshold, 0.1% rather than 1% threshold. So, otherwise, if it were category 4 or 5, it would be thrown out, right? Because the 2% would be below 1. But in categories 1, 2 for UN and OSHA, or categories 1 through 3 for Europeans, you include it even though it's below 1%. So just that's an aside. Comes into play a little bit later. So let's do 0.2. Okay, and now let's go to the hazards tab and do the suggestion report. And what we get here, if you look at the top, suggested GHS classifications for health, it comes up with a category 3 oral for acute toxicity and oral acute toxicity estimate for the mixture of 148 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. If we go back to the example and look what they calculated, it's the same thing. They got, for their acute toxicity estimate, 148 for the ATE, acute toxicity estimate, and category 3. So we got the same thing as they did. All right, this is a fairly simple example. Let's try something else. When you have entered, let's go back, I'll say done. When you go back to these ingredients, what the program is actually doing is for these ingredients that have the hazard class, right, the acute toxicity category 3 in this case, and we also have a physical number, like a measurement up here. The program is actually using the measurement. It's not using the classification to get a point estimate. Recall that there's a table that in older versions of SDScribe, it just uses a value that it reads off of a standard lookup table. But here, you've got an actual measurement, so it's going to use that instead. So in theory, we should be able to go to each one of these that has a classification like this and get rid of them. All right, so remember the second one was an unknown, but the third one has a classification. I'll get rid of that. And then the fourth one was an unknown, right? But the fifth ingredient has a classification. I'll get rid of that. So press done. So now we've gotten rid of all our classifications, and it has to read just the numeric value that's above the toxicology table. Let's go back to the safety data sheet itself, that record. And let's do this again. Let's go to the hazards tab and click on the suggestions button again. And here, it's still the same. It's a category 3 acute toxicity, but the mixture has now a different milligrams per kilogram for the estimate, the acute toxicity estimate. So let's go down below and see why that is. These are the details, and this might be helpful for you because you're going to see what the rationale is. So we're under oral toxicity and what it gets for each ingredient, and you notice it's only got 2 ingredients here, even though we had 3 ingredients that had categories, right, and that had measurements. So it skipped one. We've got the ingredient 1 and ingredient 3, but we don't have ingredient 5, right? So that's causing this to change. You remember before we had, well, you probably don't remember this. I didn't show it to you. I'm sorry. What happened, if you remember, I was talking about, because this is in category 2, ingredient 5, and it's below the 1% threshold that would normally apply. Basically, the category 2 determines that it is relevant. So you get that last calculation in there, the 0.2 over 10 in the denominator when you're calculating the toxicity of mixture. But in this case, we don't have that third element. We just have the 4% over 125 and the 3% over 15. The third part of the calculation is missing. Let's go back to our ingredients and let's make ingredient 5 relevant. We're not going to put in this time the hazard. We're not going to put in category 2 again, but we're going to go directly back to the toxicological table, and we're going to click this box for no thresholds. What that means is that it's not going to consider a threshold for any of these categories that you might enter. So whether it's 0.2 or 0.02 or 1 or 3%, it'll always be a relevant category. And some of you apparently do this anyway. You always, like in your spreadsheets, consider each ingredient to be relevant. So we're going to say done, and now this is going to make this particular ingredient 5 relevant. So if we go back to here to the to the safety data sheet and click on it again, if you look, the health suggestion is back to 148 milligrams per kilogram. And if we go down and see the explanation for you see that it now has all those 3 ingredients that have acute toxicity measurements and the values for them. So that's the reason when it did the calculation, now see has that third element in the adjusted concentrations, just like over here it has the 3 elements, and so that's the reason. So that sort of explains to you why it's still important that you keep in mind the relevance of your ingredients when you do a calculation like this. Although in this case the difference between 148 and 230 whatever it was is not going to make a difference between a category 3 and a category 2 in this case. So that's what I wanted to cover with you. Thanks for listening.